Imagine walking home after a night out. It's the early morning hours of April 11th, 1981. A 23-year-old woman named Yolanda Herrera has just left a bar in Texas. She's supposed to be going home, but Yolanda never makes it there. 2 days later, her body is discovered in a field. Investigators collect evidence. They search for a killer, but there is one problem. Nobody can identify him. Years become decades. 1981 becomes 1991, then 2001, then 2011, and eventually more than 4 decades pass. But investigators never completely forget Yolanda. Then DNA technology advances, and suddenly, evidence collected from Yolanda's body decades earlier begins pointing toward a name, a man who had been living hundreds of miles away. And when investigators finally confronted him, police say he confessed to killing her. This is the story of Yolanda Herrera, a 23-year-old woman whose murder remained unsolved for nearly 45 years, and how one tiny piece of DNA evidence eventually changed everything. It was April 11th, 1981. Yolanda Herrera was 23 years old and living in the Universal City area of Texas, near San Antonio. That night, she had been at a bar known as Johnny's Inn. According to investigators, Yolanda left the establishment at around 2:30 in the morning. She was believed to be walking home, and that detail is important, because at this point, there was nothing to suggest that this would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Imagine the scene. It's the middle of the night. The streets are quiet. Yolanda is walking home, and somewhere along that journey, something happens. Investigators later concluded that she had been attacked, but whoever was responsible disappeared. Yolanda did not make it home, and her family was left wondering where she was. For 2 days, there was no answer. Then came April 13th. 2 children walking to school made a horrifying discovery. Yolanda's body was found in a field near East Aviation Drive in Universal City. The location was several feet away from the roadway and wasn't easily visible to passing drivers. Police arrived and began processing the scene. What they found turned a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. An autopsy determined that Yolanda had died from multiple blunt force injuries. Investigators also found evidence consistent with sexual assault. But there was something else. Something that would become incredibly important decades later. Biological evidence had been preserved, and nobody knew it at the time. But that evidence would eventually outlive the investigation itself. In 1981, forensic DNA technology was nowhere near what it is today. Investigators could collect evidence, they could preserve it, they could interview witnesses, they could follow leads, but they couldn't simply upload a DNA profile into a database and instantly receive a suspect's name. So the case became a cold case, and cold cases can be cruel, because as the years pass, witnesses disappear. Memories fade, records become harder to find, people move, and sometimes the person responsible simply continues living their life. But investigators didn't completely abandon Yolanda's case. According to police, it was reviewed repeatedly over the decades. Eventually, investigators were able to develop a male DNA profile from the preserved evidence. But there was a problem. There was no match. The profile didn't identify anyone in the available law enforcement databases. So investigators did what they could. They conducted interviews, they collected samples from potential suspects, but again, nothing. No match, no name, no arrest. The case remained stuck, and for Yolanda's family, the question remained, who killed her? Then came the breakthrough. In the year 2021, investigators were able to develop a male DNA profile from evidence preserved from the case. For the first time, they had something extremely valuable, but still, they didn't have a person. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the databases investigators searched. So investigators turned toward forensic genetic genealogy. If you're not familiar with that term, here's the simple version. Instead of asking, does this DNA match a criminal already in our database? Investigators can ask, can this DNA help us find relatives of the person we're looking for? And if enough relatives can be identified, investigators may be able to construct a family tree. That family tree can eventually lead them to the person whose DNA they're trying to identify. In Yolanda's case, investigators obtained information pointing toward the surname Brower or variations of it. But even then, the investigation wasn't finished. There was another obstacle. There was only a very small amount of DNA available. Technology had advanced, but apparently it hadn't advanced enough. Investigators had a potential direction. But they needed better technology, so they waited and continued working. Then, in 2025, the evidence was sent to Othram, a laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA testing. According to Othram, scientists were able to develop a genetic profile from the extremely limited sample. Their forensic genetic genealogy team then used that information to develop investigative leads, and one name began standing out: Kelly Lee Brower. This is where the investigation becomes especially interesting, because Brower wasn't a completely random person who appeared out of nowhere. Investigators determined that he had lived in Universal City around the time Yolanda was murdered. That meant the genetic lead had now intersected with geography. The person they were investigating had a connection to the very place where the murder happened. But investigators still needed proof. They eventually traced Brower to Cottonwood, Arizona. Arizona authorities assisted with the investigation. Investigators conducted surveillance, and then they obtained a DNA sample from Brower. That sample was compared with the evidence preserved from Yolanda's autopsy. And according to police, the DNA matched. Think about that. The evidence had been collected in 1981. 44 years later, technology had finally allowed investigators to connect it to a living suspect. But investigators weren't finished. They still had to confront him. So Universal City Police and Texas Rangers traveled to Arizona. They met with Brower. And during that interview, police say something happened that investigators had waited decades to hear. Brower confessed to the murder. On August 19, 2026, Kelly Lee Brower was arrested in Cottonwood, Arizona, on a capital murder warrant connected to Yolanda Herrera's death. The arrest came nearly 45 years after Yolanda was killed. According to investigators, Brower had eventually left the Universal City area after the murder. He later lived in other states before settling in Arizona. And for decades, there was nothing publicly connecting him to Yolanda's murder. Police say his criminal history didn't point investigators toward him either. That makes the DNA breakthrough even more significant. Because without the preserved evidence from 1981, investigators might never have found him. And without advances in genetic genealogy and DNA testing, that evidence might have remained unidentified. But after decades of dead ends, investigators finally had a suspect, and they had a DNA match. And according to police, they had a confession. Brower is now awaiting extradition to Texas, where he is expected to face the case in Bexar County. The biggest question, but there is still something haunting about this case. Why Yolanda? Investigators have described the killing as a crime of opportunity. They say there is no indication that Brower and Yolanda knew each other. According to investigators, the theory is that Brower encountered Yolanda while she was walking home after leaving the bar. But many details surrounding exactly what happened during those final moments remain unknown. And that's one of the hardest parts of a cold case. For 45 years, Yolanda couldn't tell investigators what happened. Her family couldn't tell them. The witnesses couldn't give them the answer. So investigators had to let the evidence speak. And eventually, it did. A tiny piece of biological evidence, preserved from a 1981 autopsy, survived long enough for technology to catch up with it. That's the extraordinary part of this case. The evidence didn't expire. The DNA didn't forget. It waited. 45 years of waiting. For Yolanda's family, this wasn't simply another police investigation. It was 45 years of unanswered questions. Decades without knowing who was responsible. Decades without knowing whether the case would ever be solved. And now, investigators have finally identified the man they say killed Yolanda. Police have said the arrest brings a sense of closure to her family. And that word, closure, can sometimes sound simple. But imagine waiting almost half a century for an answer. Imagine being told year after year that the case remains unsolved. Imagine wondering whether the person responsible was still alive, whether he was still walking around somewhere, whether he had ever thought about what happened. And then one day, the phone rings, and investigators tell you, "We found him." Yolanda Herrera was 23 years old when she was killed. In 1981, nobody could have predicted that evidence from her case would eventually help identify her killer nearly half a century later. But investigators preserved that evidence. they kept reviewing the case. And when DNA technology finally became advanced enough, they tried again. The result was a name, then a DNA match, then an arrest, and according to police, a confession. Yolanda's case is a powerful reminder that a cold case isn't necessarily a dead case. Sometimes, the evidence is simply waiting for the technology to catch up. After 45 years, investigators finally have a suspect in the murder of Yolanda Herrera. But for her family, the most important thing isn't the DNA, it isn't the arrest, it isn't the headlines. It's that after nearly half a century, someone finally answered the question they had been asking all along. Who killed Yolanda? And now,